It's great to have you all here today on the SiblingsToo Day event. And I want to just take a moment really quickly and give you all an opportunity to introduce yourselves to our audience. Just let us know who you are, where you are, and what is bringing you to the conversation today. So Maria, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, thank you for having me, Nancy. I am Maria Socolof. I am on Long Island, New York, and I am a survivor. I've experienced sibling sexual trauma, and I've written my memoir, and I am a co-founding member of 5 Waves, a nonprofit that is looking towards advocating for and healing sibling sexual trauma.
Excellent, thank you.
Here to speak out.
Great, it's great to have you here. Jane, how about yourself?
Thank you for bringing us all together, Nancy. Thank you for allowing us to be part of this very important discussion. My name is Jane Epstein. I am outside the Bay Area in California. I am a survivor who experienced sibling sexual abuse and trauma. Felt like I was alone, thought I was the only one, did not understand that what had happened to me really did change the trajectory of my life. And I decided to start speaking up about it. And my best avenue, because the media would not hear me, was I gave a TEDx talk giving sibling sexual abuse a voice. And I'm so grateful to be connected with Nancy and Maria and now Phil and Paula. So let's raise awareness.
Great, thank you, Jane. And Paula.
Thank you for having me here as well and for being with these beautiful people, you know. And well, I'm Paula Lobos Sucarrat. I'm from Chile. And I'm also a survivor of sexual abuse. That also, you know, makes me decided the ways that I will turn my path in the work that I do. I'm a psychologist and a teacher for learning disabilities. And I've been working in the field of supporting children and young people that have displayed harmful sexual behavior alongside the NGO Paikavi, which I still work with. And I have also worked in other places, especially in Scotland, where I display the same work as well. So lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting us.
It's great to have you too. And it must be a real shock, Chile to Scotland and back again.
Yes,
like
it was.
That's quite a journey.
Especially weather.
Yeah, especially the weather, yeah.
April is very lovely.
Thank you, Paula. And Phil.
Thanks for having me. I'm very glad to be a part of this. Phil Goldstein. I am a survivor of child sexual abuse, sibling sexual abuse. I am a published poet. I published a book last year, How to Bury a Boy at Sea, about reckoning with the trauma of sexual abuse, and just glad to be here to offer the male perspective, which I think, although it's growing, is often lacking in these conversations. So very glad to be a part of this.
And we're very glad to have you as part of that conversation, because you're right, it's a conversation that's underrepresented quite often. So it's great to have you involved in the SiblingsToo Day event. So what we want to talk about now, as I said, are some of the obstacles and opportunities that society generally and parents specifically have in understanding sibling sexual abuse, understanding its impacts, and family dynamics and things like that. In the whole conversation of the event today, there are other sections that deal with all sorts of different parts, but this is an important part of the conversation because I want to put on the table the things that are happening that are getting in the way. Like, let's be real about stuff that's getting in the way, both at, say, a personal level, at a family level, and a societal level. Let's just name it and put it on the table. But then also let's talk about the things that are going on, the newer research, for example, the way the media is changing its approach, etc. Let's put those on the table as well, because this isn't a conversation about doom and gloom. This is a conversation about truth and what we can do with that truth to improve things now and in future. So I know that in another section of today's event, we had a more detailed conversation, but one of the problems, one of the things that causes a lot of confusion is problematic definitions and terminology around sibling sexual abuse. So Just as an example, quite often sibling sexual abuse is lumped into conversations about family incest. Well, there's so many different types of family incest that it's just sort of lumped in there. And I know myself, when I was growing up, that conversation didn't do anything for me. I didn't see myself represented in that conversation. And then also the terminology that we use between survivor versus person who was harmed versus abuse versus trauma versus all of these other terms. So, and I know you guys all have an opinion about these sorts of things. So we know terminology and definitions are a problem. What do you think needs to happen in order to fix that?
Do you want anyone to jump in?
Anyone jump in?
I want to sort of start at the higher level, at the what we call it, sibling sexual abuse, sibling sexual trauma. We've had this conversation before. I never want to minimize anybody's personal experience, and it is abuse. It's abuse of many things: abuse of power, abuse of boundaries, abuse of lots of things. But in the context of trying to prevent this and help the big picture, I personally like to use trauma as the word. I know the act, trauma is what is a result of something that happens, but when I like to think of this as sibling sexual trauma, to me, it is that makes the stigma a little less, maybe, so that those who are causing harm may be more willing to speak out or seek help, or just admit that they did it, instead of keeping this hidden and silent, and the ones who are harmed, for throwing them further back into hiding and silenced when it's never recognized. So in that bigger picture, I personally like to address the whole gamut of sibling sexual trauma, and again, never minimizing what anybody wants to call their own experience.
I think you bring up a good point about, first off, saying we never want to minimize anybody's experience. And I think that is, again, it's one of the problems when there isn't clear definitions about things. There are words that society uses across not all societies, as I'm sure Paula can allude to. There are different terms that are used. I was reading a report about how sibling sexual abuse is referred to in a European country, which is very different than how it's referred to here in North America, for example. So letting a person use the language that they need to use, whatever that happens to be. We don't need to get into arguments about the terms, right? Which is one of the problems that occurs. People get very fixed on the term that they feel they need to use without necessarily understanding the gamut of the terms and what those terms mean. Just moving on from that, though, again, in another section I've spoken about, there's no clear definition for sibling sexual abuse. Like there's no there are adult to child abuse, pretty clear cut. If this is occurring, that's abuse, that's wrong. We're not having it. But we have a problem that comes from parents being able to determine the differences between normal sexual curiosity and problematic behavior, and then abusive behavior. And Paula, because you work in this domain and you work with people very specifically who have caused harm, and who are displaying problematic sexual behavior, what are your thoughts about how this lack of clear definition is impacting people's ability to talk about this subject?
I mean, I think that the impact is previous. There is an impact to speak about sexuality in general. So more so, to speak about if you have been abused, just because it's just difficult, it's difficult to speak about things that are in your intimacy, but also they could have placed a secrecy around. So it's very complex. That's why I think I like when you said that we cannot impose, but it's true as well that we need to find some definitions that allow us all to speak a kind of a similar language. We need to be very patient because we have cultural things, and different types and approaches as well. But I think what it allows to recognize that is something that it happens in interfamiliar spaces, in contextual, in family relations that are connected with maybe a concept of family that can be expanded, not only, about blood, related about blood, So it's something that it happens within the family context and care.
Mhm.
And it happens between a relationship that it felt like, related to each other
Yeah.
in a way that we grow up as brothers and
Yes.
sisters.
For sure. And I know I've had conversations with people who have sort of said, oh, well, it didn't happen with a sibling, so therefore it wasn't abuse. And it was my cousin. It's like, okay, well, again, it demonstrates that there's this confusion, because I know when I'm talking about SSA, I'm also referring to near age cousins or, family members that may not be living in the house with you, but you see frequently enough, more than once every 5 years, but, like fairly frequently. And also blended families, step families, and all the rest of it. So that's a little nuance of terminology there. So
Can I tell you something more? I think that these difficulties in the terminology can be explained as well, that we are creating the field, and it's because we're talking about it kind of for the very first time. We're addressing this a kind of a responsibility, and that is very good. So yeah, we need to continue making the field to grow, and to make better understanding or more precisions, So
Yes.
multi-agency work, I think, is very important for that.
Excellent. And Jane, you were.
I kind of wanted, this is kind of encapsulates a little bit of like what you and Maria were starting to go down the path of. I feel like if we can share our stories, and Nancy, you are allowing people to share their stories anonymously in your podcast, because I think there's a power in sharing our stories, and it's hard to come forward, but there are more and more survivors coming forward, sharing their stories publicly. And what I've gained from that is I've had people reach out to me saying, I knew something was wrong. I knew something happened to me, but hearing you and talk about your story, now I understand that what I experienced was, and they can experience it however they choose. Some of them choose it as abuse, some of them trauma, some of them harmful sexual behavior. So I do believe that the power of our stories and us coming forward, more and more people are identifying and saying, okay, something did happen to me. So I firmly believe in continuing to share our stories.
Absolutely. I think that's important. And I think it's also important that as this conversation continues over the coming months and years, that parents feel that they can share their story with other parents. And I've said this before. I don't know if I've said it in this event, but I've certainly said it on my podcast. Survivors of anything tend to find each other eventually, particularly now with Facebook and stuff. It's easier for survivors to find others. It's less so for those who cause harm. They're never going to find each other. They sort of need to go to Paula and other professionals and those who can support them in that way. A step forward would be those who are causing harm finding each other. Also, though, parents, they fall in between the two. They're less likely, parents, to go to other parents and say, oh, this is happening in my family, or I'm concerned it might be happening in my family. That is currently a big block for parents who may be listening in today. We have to acknowledge that this is a difficult subject for parents to wrap their heads around. No parent is going to put up their hand and go, woohoo, let's all talk about sibling sexual abuse and siblings harming each other and causing sexual harm and all that sort of stuff. Let's do that. That's very rarely going to happen. But I think that it is important that we, as you say, Jane, keep telling the stories and making it possible for people to tell their stories without then being bashed in one form or another, whether it's the survivor or person who was harmed, the person who caused harm, or the family structure. Because we all know that when kids do something wrong, it's usually the parent's fault. right? So that's usually the excuse or the scapegoat. Phil, I think you might have something to say.
Yeah, I just want to pop in on that point in particular and say that, obviously when a child who's been abused by their sibling decides to come forward about that, the parent is not usually the first person who the child winds up telling, especially if it happens, the disclosure happens when they're an adult, because they have other people in their life who, they're going to tell, whether that's their partner or a friend or another family member. Eventually, often, they do wind up telling the parent about what happened. And that causes, I think, this sort of multi-level shame that happens. One, that the parent didn't know that it was happening at the time that it was occurring and that they missed it. And so there's, these feelings of guilt. There's this feeling of shame that, oh gosh, other people in the world have known that this happened in my family, under my roof, before I did.
Mm.
And, what do they think of me? And, I think that there are a lot of ways that a parent can respond to the disclosure by, their child telling them that this happened, my brother, my sister abused me in this way in our home, that, can be harmful to the survivor. But I think that it's important, for us as, survivors, and us just as a general community working through this, to acknowledge that it can be a real, world turning upside down shock when you as the parent find out about this. And, that can cause you to feel this complex, stew of emotions of, grief, of anger, of sadness. And unfortunately, sometimes that, leads to the parent winding up, lashing out or feeling angry at the child who has disclosed, which is obviously not helpful to the child who's disclosing. But I think it's important to just acknowledge that there's this multifaceted response that's triggered, in the parents, and it's important to feel empathy, even if you as the survivor want to understandably want them to sort of just rush to your side, which is certainly what I felt, when I disclosed to my parents. And then, when I didn't get that, I was very hurt and very upset. But, it's this real kind of mind-bending thing to discover, often, obviously, decades after it's occurred.
And I think what we're sort of all referring to in some way or another is that there is a lack of what one could say education for parents and family members, not only that this exists and occurs, but of, how to manage it, how to handle it, like you do other things that happen in a family. There are woeful gaps in access to information for parents. I mean, I can go to the library and get a book on how to change diapers, and I can get a book on, all sorts of other things of parenting, parenting advice. I don't know of any books myself that talk very specifically. Let me rephrase that. Only recently am I seeing books starting to come out now about things like talking to your child about consent or body safety and all that sort of stuff. It's only recently that those sorts of books have been coming out. So I think we can summarize some of what we're saying as not only society, but parents in general have a lack of education or awareness about this subject, which is getting in the way of us dealing with this subject. Much like I think it's also supported, I'll come to you in just a sec, Maria, it's also supported that, and I think we'll all acknowledge, there's not a lot of research on sibling sexual abuse specifically as compared to other things yet. And we do know that it's coming, but that sort of, again, gap in research means that there's less knowledge about a subject. And that contributes to some of this confusion, lack of understanding in society generally, because there's not enough information going out into society, lack of resources for parents to go and say, what is this thing? What do I need to be concerned about? And then even if it never ever happens in my lifetime, what do I need to think of or consider to help protect my children, essentially from each other? Maria, you had a thought?
Yeah, I just, second everything Phil said and what you said, Nancy, as well. The good news on this side of this is that there is now, well, you said the parents aren't going to be raising their hands and screaming out to anybody, but there is a parents group now. It's a Facebook group, but there are places to go and it's growing quickly.
Yes.
So they're finding that community. There's the SiblingsSexualTrauma.com website, which has enormous amount of information because it was just never there, and it's what, a year old now. And so there is information that's accessible now. So I think we're moving in the right direction, and we've just got it's just a small little snowflake that started this snowball here. But yeah, I just wanted to say that things are moving
Yes.
in that direction.
Yes, I think that it's a good opportunity then to shift our conversation away from problems and lack, and I think before I do that though, I do want to acknowledge that a concern and a problem that we know to be true is that issues of culture and religion get in the way of this conversation. Not only just having a conversation in perhaps a religious environment, say, but then the tenets of that religion or faith might get in the way of actually having the conversation. So and I would also sort of allude to, we need to acknowledge that there are problems in legislation and there are problems in the criminal justice system, in that in many jurisdictions, one of the key concerns that parents have is, if I disclose this to social services or to anybody, the police are going to swoop in and take all my kids away because this is against the law. And again, I think it's because there is a lack of understanding of this particular form of abuse, even in, say, the police force or the criminal justice system, that it gets lumped in, much like we started this conversation, it gets lumped in with other forms of child abuse, as if the person who was causing the harm was an adult. And we have spoken, I spoke with Brad Watts and Spencer Bailey about this in another section, is that a key factor in people who are causing problematic sexual, or who have problematic sexual behavior, it's less about any sort of deviance or anything like that, and more about brain development, family environment, and natural maturation and puberty and things like that are occurring. And so this lack of understanding the criminal justice system by the criminal justice system, I'm sorry, sort of leaks out into the fears that parents and society has generally. The reason why something is taboo is because people are afraid of it. And people are afraid of it because they have a lack of understanding or a lack of knowledge. But let's not talk about lack anymore. Let's talk about all the good stuff that we see happening. Paula, you're in Chile, so I'm going to swing around to you in a second. I want to hear what's going on in Latin America and the things that you see happening, and in your contacts around the world as well. And as you said, Maria, I know that SiblingsSexualTrauma.com and some other sites and Facebook groups are all there now, gaining a lot of traction, and things are happening. There are some other sites in other parts of the world as well that are language specific. So I know a couple of other what I would consider foreign language websites that are similar, that provide these sorts of resources as well. So that's a real opportunity. The internet, while it can be an horrendous place to be, it is now creating communities of change and communities of collaboration. All of us met through the internet, through connecting in that way. So that's a real opportunity that we can take advantage of. But so Paula, let's go to you, and then I'll want to hear from everybody else about what you're seeing that you think now is this way forward. So Paula, what's going on with you? And what do you see?
I'm still in the previous part in my mind, because but I will go there. Is just I needed to say that it is so important to raise this awareness, because you know, there is this sibling abuse, you know, but sometimes between siblings abuse, it can be also an adult that is using them for exploitation, for example. So you will be able just to see the siblings abuse between them, but you won't be able to see that interfamiliar problems sometimes are massive and very, very big. That's why I'm saying that, you know, this raise awareness, you know, this capacity to think beyond is really, really hard. So we can kind of see the, you know, the point of the iceberg, you know, but we don't see what is below the surface. So I
That's a good
think
point. Yeah.
yeah, so it is important, you know, it is important to think beyond, not to scare people, you know, but the problems that common people lives, you know, the majority of the world is poor. So there's a lot of people suffering things that are not in our imagination, you know. So I think this raise awareness in from the NGO Valkyrie, we have a page that has resources in Spanish. They are all free to download, so you can have access to those. But also Valkyrie has developed a way to work with a kind of a model of shared responsibilities between the context, the family, and the children. So we have promoted this in different parts of the world, Latin America, and especially with our relationship with SOS Children's Villages, that we have done our work there. We're also doing work in Mexico and other parts of Latin America, where the agency are starting to work in this kind of a model. For example, they're promoting new models to work with, even to work with young people that is in prison. You were naming the thing in the law, and in supervision, they were commenting about a situation of a young person that displayed this type of behavior. But then you are responsible as soon as you do, then they prove if you're guilty or not. So young people in prison since they're 14 or 15, and he's 26 and still in prison. So there are a lot of things that are really, you know, that's why it's so important to start to speak, to raise awareness, to understand, to promote adequacy in policies as well, and children's right too.
It's difficult to create change, for any of us to create change, if there's no awareness. You know, that's why I think the big push, particularly over the last year, and I know the work that you've been doing, Jane, and Maria and Phil and others who are adult survivors, are really pushing that awareness, because none of the other stuff that we want to have happen, say change in sex education curriculum, or a revisit of the criminal justice system, or any of these other things, can happen if there's no A, political will, and B, societal pressure, and both of those go together. So politicians aren't going to do a lot, and don't want to sound controversial here, but they're not going to put a lot of attention on something unless it's a threat to their seat. So the more political will there is, and the more pressure there is from society, and it's this sort of the bottom-up approach, for want of a better term, where society, where parents in their own home look to make changes in their own home, and then they look outward to begin creating change in their community, in their conversations with others, and maybe their sex education curriculum, and these sorts of things that create that pressure. So you're absolutely right, Paula. It is about awareness. And it is also, I think, when one is raising awareness, you are making the unthinkable possible in somebody's head. Because, you know, who wants to think that perhaps one of their children is going to cause sexual trauma to another one of their children? But it happens at rates that people, when I share the statistics that's shown in research with people, they're just like, no, that can't be. And it's like, yes, it can, and yes, it is. So, you know, as you say, raising awareness makes the unthinkable possible to discuss. We can't discuss it if people are in total denial. So you raise a very good point there. But you also raise something else, which I think we want to really look at, is this collaborative nature. I'm seeing so much collaboration now, and I've had others say to me when putting together this event, first off, the ease by which I'm able to contact people. Like most people are like, yeah, count me in, I'm there. Like, let's do this and let's have this conversation. But the collaborative nature, particularly amongst the professionals and the academics, let's share our research, let's share our resources so that we can put it out in the world. And by the way, those resources that you mentioned on your website, Paula, will be in the resources pack that the audience get. So I don't know about you guys, but I'm seeing a lot more collaboration. And I mean a lot more when I'm thinking about this versus other subjects. There's a lot of people who want to speak out. And Phil, what are you noticing the same thing?
Oh, absolutely. You know, you have great organizations like Five Waves. You know, there's Facebook groups, you know, for both for parents and for peers, you know, who want to talk about being survivors of sexual abuse. And I just think that there is a greater awareness and openness in the culture, you know, whether that is in books. You know, I obviously wrote a book of poetry. There are lots of memoirs that have come out, you know, including and especially from men who are helping to really reduce the stigma around coming forward, which I think is just so important because, you know, even though it's certainly less than it was, say, a decade ago, it's still really prevalent. You know, you're not a real man, quote unquote, if you, you know, admit to being, you know, admit to being abused. And so I think that that's starting to change. You know, you see documentaries like the Leaving Neverland documentary about Wade Robson and James Safechuck. And I just think that there is, you know, as that sort of ferment and that openness comes to the culture, I think you're seeing that really catalyze more connections between people because people just feel more seen and more open to discussing things. You know, when you see your story reflected in a story that other people are viewing and taking in or reading about, then you just feel more comfortable talking to somebody about that. And that doesn't mean that you have to, you know, go on a world tour and tell everybody, you know, that you can about what happened to you, but it maybe opens the door for you to have a conversation, find a support group, talk to just, you know, somebody intimately in your life about what happened to you. And, you know, maybe over time that grows into you connecting with other survivors. But unless and until we see the change in the culture, I don't think we're going to see those connections. And I'm really glad that we are starting to see that, and that is catalyzing those connections.
The connections, I think, as you say, are very important, and definitely different than they were 20 years ago. I'm old enough to be talking about 40 years ago, and you know, certain things would never have been spoken about. But as you say, as people come forward, and I think particularly men and men in positions of power or celebrity who are stepping up forward now and talking about, regardless of the abuse, it might not have been sibling sexual abuse, but they're talking about having been abused or sexually abused in some form. That opens the door for that conversation. So going back to, you know, sharing stories and sort of the collaborative nature of thing, even sharing stories is a form of collaboration. You know, you find your tribe, as it were, and you have a mutual understanding, which I think is super important. Just to share with you, on one of the other sections was Nusrat Khan from India. We did a version of this conversation for the UK and Europe, and she was referring to, like, she's based in, her work is based in India. She spends a lot of her time in Dubai, but she speaks internationally. And she does a lot of work on child sexual abuse and sibling sexual abuse specifically. And she has a new program coming out now where it's about child warriors. So it's children who are willing to sit down with parents and discuss their experiences to help the parents understand. So the children are stepping forward and they are being trained and they're supervised and all the rest of it to actually do this kind of work, which to me is like, oh, like I just think it's amazing. And I think it's going to be so impactful, and they're looking to do that on a global scale in collaboration with other organizations and other representatives in other countries. So again, we're talking about this collaborative nature of solutions. And even in her own work and in others, I'm currently thinking about her work, but there are others who do this as well. She has created relationships with key stakeholders in society, in the corporate world, in the education field and all the rest of it. So she's gained access into these because these groups as well, the corporates and everything, are looking to collaborate. So in terms of going forward from here, where does this conversation of sibling sexual abuse go forward from here? I think you guys would all agree that it is about raising awareness to eliminate, or let's be realistic, to reduce stigma, and then focus on collaboration between, like we are in this whole event, professionals, academics, and lived experience experts coming together to not only raise awareness now, but create programs, education, changes in legislation, all these sorts of other things. I think you guys would all agree that that's sort of the path that you see. Maria, you were.
Yeah, I'm just, I guess, reiterating sort of, but as far as from the lived experience perspective, I think because we were so hidden, so silenced, and so in the shadows for forever, that this collaboration really has been cemented in that we're finally seeing a community and being able to even talk about it. So just, I think maybe like we're saying, maybe compared to some other fields or something, I don't know if it's different, but it feels like it's so just such a groundswell starting, and just it has this foundation based on we're finally finding someone who understands and is listening, and even amongst ourselves that we didn't even know anybody else was out there. So, I think that's part of this collaboration that's growing.
For sure. Jane, what are your thoughts?
I love collaboration. I
know.
started, I do. I am a team player. I don't want to reinvent the wheel if someone else is doing it. Fabulous. I started coming forward in 2014, and I literally thought I was the only one. I started a Facebook page, and people would message me, but they wouldn't say anything on the Facebook page. And then parents started messaging me, and I thought, okay, I didn't have that parent perspective. I only had the survivor perspective. And when parents and step-parents started messaging me, I thought, oh my gosh, this is really a big deal. And so I just started getting louder and louder and louder. And that's how, I slowly met Maria, and then I met Nancy, and I'm meeting Phil, and now Paula. And together we can do this. No person needs or wants to do this alone. I don't want to run a podcast. Great. Nancy's got a podcast, and someone else is a great writer. I'm all about the collaboration, and I'm thrilled that we are building and building and building. And as Nancy says, this genie is not going back in the bottle. I just don't see how it can go back now.
Yeah. And I think we can extend that collaborative nature out to parents who are needing to think about, and Paula, I'm sure you'd agree with this as well. It's possible that sibling sexual abuse would never happen in one's family, but not being educated about it, not just sticking your head in the sand and thinking, oh, it doesn't happen on my street, in my town, or on, in my socioeconomic status. That type of denial is just dangerous. And what I like to think is, there will be parents who listen to this event and they'll never have to deal with this subject, and good. I'll be very happy. But at the very least, if parents are learning about a subject like this, then potentially their behavior and their communication style will change in such a way that it's helpful for the family anyway. I mean, if you're learning about chatting with your children about body safety, then you're also learning about chatting with your children about their career choices. Do you know what I mean? Like you're just creating a mechanism to improve your ability to parent. Paula, would you agree with that? Because you deal with parents all the time.
Yes. I mean, it's so important what you're saying. This reflective capacity that I call mentalization, you know, it's capacity to think about your reactions and the reactions of others, and just to think about show some curiosity about the world of my child, my children, you know, independently of the age that they have, but also creating opportunities to communicate, to talk, and to be able to wonder. We need to wonder each other in ourselves, you know. I am willing to have difficult conversation, or I just avoid it, you know, or I just prefer not to talk to, you know. Am I connecting with my child? I am touching them, I'm holding them, because, you know, sexuality have the same things as attachment, and I think it's hard to live without any heart or any, you know, love or feeling that someone pays attention to you. So I do think that this capacity of think, yes, I'm willing to think difficult and to have difficult conversations, you know. Yes, I'm willing to listen this podcast until
Yes.
the end, you know.
And I think as well, you know, I'm a step parent, and I think everybody on this call is a parent. And Phil, you're not a parent. I think all the women are. And I'm sure we would all agree that we wake up every morning wondering how we're going to screw things up today. So, and again, I mean, people joke about it, and parents will talk to each other in the quiet about, oh God, I'm such a bad parent, you know, and all this sort of stuff. But it is about being aware that even that sort of holding on to that, what's the word I'm looking for here? Holding on to that mentality that I'm going to screw things up or whatever gets in the way of a parent being as good a parent as they possibly can be. At the same time, every parent, no matter what, does their best whenever. And we are going to screw things up sometimes. But to deny this subject out of fear that we're really going to screw something up is in and of itself screwing this up. So I would much rather be fully educated about a subject and then be in choice if I screw it up than being totally, allowing myself to be totally ignorant. So parental openness to this conversation, I think, is super important. And Maria, I see you.
Yeah, I keep
No, it's good.
waving.
That's the only way I can see you.
Yeah, and it's sort of what you started to say a little bit earlier too, and some of what Paula said, to the point of it's not just certain families, it's not just dysfunctional families, it's everywhere and everyone. So my family, parents, Harvard, Radcliffe, doctor and psychologist, had everything we ever wanted, and it happened in my family. So and it happens with all other traumas going on in families. It's just, it really is across the board. So targeting parents at this point, saying, yeah, you kind of want to have a blind eye because you just figure it's not going to be in your family, but it can be everywhere and is. So I just want to reiterate that.
Yeah, absolutely. It is the sort of, I think one of the hardest things for parents to wrap their head around, because when we think about sexual, I wouldn't say crime, but sexual behavior that is harmful or problematic, we always think about the person down the street, or we always think of a deviant adult. There is little, as you were sort of saying before, Paula, there's little scope in people's heads that children can harm each other sexually. And I know people have said to me in quite aggressive tones sometimes that trying to do what I'm doing with the podcast and this event and everything is actually getting in the way of the innocence of children. Because what we might do is then make parents hyper vigilant, or, you know, changing sex education means that kids will learn that other kids can hurt them and it will take away their innocence. And I'm just like to that one. And I've spoken to a lot of professionals like, you know, Paula, someone like yourself, and people, children are really resilient kids, and they're really okay if somebody has an honest conversation with them and says to them, you know, if your brother or your sister touches you in this way, I need to know about it. It's okay for you to say no. You don't have to keep this quiet. You're not going to destroy a child's life or their relationship with their sibling by being honest with kids. I think kids are, we don't give them enough credit for being able to make sense of that sort of conversation. Again, parents being open to the idea that this can happen in their home, regardless of where they live, who they are, what their position is in society. And even, you know, Phil, I'm just going to address this to you. I've had people say to me, well, I have 2 boys, so therefore it can't happen. And it's like, oh God, just, or 2 girls, so therefore it can't happen.
Yeah, I mean, it can happen anywhere, in any configuration, in any context. And just to, I want to address exactly what you said, but just to go back to what you were saying about innocence, you know, the thing that will rob and destroy a child of their innocence is if they're abused sexually, you know, whether that's by a sibling or another child, you know, outside of the home or an adult. And so, you know, that's what robs children of innocence. So, and it's something that you obviously can never get back. But in terms of, you know, yeah, the idea of, oh, I have 2 boys, therefore this isn't something that I need to worry about, is if, you know, it's different than if you had a boy and a girl. It's just not true.
I know,
You know,
yeah.
and I think that it's, you know, the things that really are core to this are that, you know, especially in families when you have an older child and a younger child, whether that gap is, you know, 2 years or 4 years or whatever it is, that older child is going to have more authority and power over that younger child. And, you know, as they grow older, as they get, you know, towards prepubescence and puberty, I'm sure many parents would, you know, find it really common and wouldn't give a second thought to saying, okay, you know, I need to run to the store. I'm going to have my, you know, 12-year-old who I trust and I think is responsible enough look after my 10-year-old or my 9-year-old while I'm gone for half an hour. And, you know, that definitely can be an opportunity. And, you know, as Maria is saying in our chat, can also be a younger sibling abusing an older sibling. So, you know, I definitely don't want to discount that. It can be anything. And so, you know, it's important to really be attuned to what are the dynamics that are happening, you know, in your family and between your children. And, you know, are you noticing anything different in terms of their behavior toward one another? And sometimes these signs can be really subtle.
Yeah.
So I think it's just important to note that it can happen in any kind of configuration.
Yes, for sure. And that is part of, you know, strong messaging today and in the resources pack where people can get more information about this. It's not that stereotypical that we might have seen in media, you know, older brother, younger sister, 6 years apart. That's what we might have seen in the media in the past. And that is just incorrect. So that does happen, but so do many other things. So I think a strong message that I would like for us to be sending, and I think you guys would agree as well, is that the parents have an opportunity by becoming educated to not only change their relationship should this situation occur, but change the relationship in their family, the dynamic in the family in any event. So just being educated on these sorts of subject matters are super important, just generally, whether this occurs in your family or not. I think, would you, as we begin to wrap up, would you guys agree with all of that? And that would be the sort of message that you would be sending?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. generally we want to talk to our children about body safety and boundaries and consent. Now that that's becoming more, there's more awareness around that. It's all encapsulated, because if your boundaries are broken as a child, how do you know what the boundary is? And it makes you more susceptible to further trauma later on in life. And I can personally attest to that. So yeah, we just
Yes.
have to, it's a great opportunity to open that door. If you have a child, that child can become a teenager. That teenager is going to roll their eyes at you. They're not going to want to come to you with questions. It's a great opportunity to start building that relationship. I know the Mama Bear Effect talks about this a lot, about if you yell at your child about spilling milk, then your child's going to be afraid to come to you about something more serious. I'm not a parenting expert. I've yelled at my kids, but I do believe that if we talk to our children from 2 and continue checking in on them and continue creating that open door policy, and if they can't come to us, make sure that they have someone else that they can come to with their questions. We need that as parents anyways.
Yeah.
We need them to be able to come to us if they go to college and they're struggling. We need to have that groundwork anyway.
Yes.
I would
And
like, sorry.
so go ahead, Paula.
Yeah, I would like to say as well that in these conversations are relevant for professionals as well, because we are people,
Yeah.
and we need professionals for us because we have families, and we are not, we're not because we know we do well, so it's difficult in general. So I think this capacity to develop better ways to communicate, to improve our reflective capacities, that's why I think I'm stressing the idea of mentalizing capacities for the families, because we are never prepared for so many different challenges that can happen in life. So we don't need to, we need to be alert, not hyper alert.
Yeah.
But it can be because anything can trigger different things or different types of challenge, because that's life. And if we're better prepared, if we know how to speak out about, if you know how to communicate, if you know how to reflect with my child. So if I improve that, probably I'm more able to tolerate as well hard feelings of my children and hard situations that my children can be.
And I think, one of the final things that is an opportunity, and you're alluding to it, there's sort of 2 things. There's a lot more professionals out there who are beginning to understand more about sibling sexual abuse and how it impacts not only the person harmed or the person doing the harm, but the rest of the family and the parents. So there's more and more resources coming by professionals, and even for professionals. More professionals are being trained. They're getting access to information now, which is great. And there are more places that parents can go beyond listening to videos today for this event, or my podcast, or Jane's TEDx, or reading books, or whatever. That's all excellent. But there are also people that parents can go talk to, have one-to-one specific conversations, and get more informed information. And that's going to get better and better and better, because this whole thing that we're talking about is this groundswell of awareness. New research is being done, more professionals are being trained, professionals are reaching out to people like me and Brad Watts and others, and asking for input as adult survivors. They're wanting our reflection, which is informing courses and materials and all that sort of stuff. And I think professionals are speaking to each other more as well, and going back to that collaborative nature and coming up with new ways of approaching things and providing information and resources for parents. So while one part of the conversation about sibling sexual abuse is frightening and, pretty horrendous in many respects, the other part of the conversation is that there are things happening. There are resources out there. There are people who are willing to support families, the whole family, and the entire dynamic of the family, or if necessary, just one person, if that's what needs to happen. So there's more and more resources out there. And I believe, because we are doing events like today's event and the other things that have been happening in the last 2 or 3 years, there's more opportunities for parents and families to be equipped to manage this situation. I have often said, and I think all of you have probably heard me say this, I'll feel my job is done when a child, a 15-year-old child, possibly a boy, says to his parents, I'm having these thoughts about my little sister or my little brother, and they're causing me a great deal of concern, and I'm uncomfortable. I don't know what to do. Can you help me? The parents don't lose their minds, and they say, of course, my son, of course, my family, and they go and they know where to go to get that support. But I think I'm more optimistic and hopeful that that's coming. I mean, it's already out there to a certain degree, but I think that's going to be happening more and more in future, where much like if my child comes to me and says, I'm sick, I feel sick, like, I've got a bad flu or, something's wrong with my gut or something like that, a parent knows to go over here. Well, if a child is having thoughts, has not yet acted out, but is having thoughts, well, there are places that child can go, which is not prison, and it's not the family automatically gets split up. That is when our work, I think, is pretty much done. Well, mine anyway. I think that, but I think because we're having these conversations, there's this collaboration, there's this openness by adult survivors, there's this willingness of parents now who are starting to come together and talk. I think what we're talking about is possible, so that we can see a change in things like sex education, criminal justice system, training for professionals, and all the rest of it. Don't know when all that's going to come in future. Wave the magic wand, it would be tomorrow, but it's not going to be tomorrow. But I think it's coming. And Maria, I sense you have something you want to say.
No, I'm just agreeing with everything you're saying. Just absolutely, yes. I do see this moving in the right direction, and that's the same, like you said, to have a child come before anything happens.
Yeah.
And stop it there. That's just so key.
Ideal. Yeah,
ideal. And even for me, if I feel like if my brother had been told, just don't touch your sister, so simple, like something that simple could have made such a difference.
Let's deal with whatever's going on with you, your brother.
Right.
Let's deal with that differently. Let's find other things here, and let's not direct you towards your sister, sort of thing. So.
And not seeing brother and children, brother and sister as properties,
Yeah.
so as objects, persons, even if they're little person.
Absolutely, and they have the capacity to I think be able to say, I don't want to do this behavior. I do believe that, particularly because we're not talking about deviant pedophiles, we are talking about young children who, for one reason or another, or in the circumstances that they're in, or whatever it happens to be, are motivated to cause harm to another sibling. I believe there are points of intervention in that don't exist with adult to child or other forms of sexual abuse. That's why I very specifically talk about sibling sexual abuse, because I think there are points of intervention that particularly professionals like yourself, Paula, and the other academics are starting to see where what are the factors, where can we intervene to stop this from happening. If you have that on the one side, and then you equip the parents with the information and just the truth, it's okay, it's the truth, let's deal with the truth. You put those two things together, and I think we do have the real opportunity to certainly reduce, if not completely prevent this from happening in future. Let's be realistic. Completely preventing, yeah, maybe not so much, but as much as humanly possible, preventing this from occurring in future. I think that dynamic is there, and as long as parents in particular keep the conversation going, there are parents who are going to be listening to this today who have still have more questions, and they want more information, and even in the discomfort of the topics that we're talking about, what will help all of this is parents to go away from this event, to look at the resources pack, and to take steps. Jane? I like that, Jane. That's good. That's a little snaky thing.
I would like to add that I am about 95% sure that had my parents talked to my sibling would not have touched me. My sibling in general was a rule follower, a good kid. And honestly, because I do have a talking relationship with my sibling, they have told me they did not understand that they were hurting me until years later.
Mm.
And I have not asked them this question, but I have the feeling that they didn't understand that they were harming themselves as well. So if we just talk about it, like in Maria's situation or my situation, I believe it wouldn't have happened if we had just talked about it. And
Yeah.
my parents, my mom was a school teacher, my dad was a school psychologist, but they didn't create an environment where we were talking about these things.
Yeah,
So-
same in my household. There was no environment for this conversation. I never saw my parents argue, but I also never saw my parents kiss or hold hands. So there was a whole conversation that just wasn't happening. And Paula, you allude to this, right? There's the conversation of sexuality of any kind doesn't happen. And therefore, there's no context where children can come and ask questions and seek understanding if there's just this, for want of a better word, cold atmosphere to these sorts of conversations. I would also suggest that although it's not the responsibility of schools, had I heard in sex education class in the little Catholic school that I went to, had I heard that it isn't necessarily the dirty guy that lives down the street, stranger danger, or weird Uncle Bob, but in actual fact, it could have been one of my siblings. Had I even heard that, I might have had the oomph to go and tell somebody, because I didn't know, because it's just not talked about, right? So I didn't know. Paula, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I think it's a risk that parents think that their children are angels without any sex, any sexuality going on, you know. Since they are very little, you know, they display contact that cause them pleasure, and it makes us to be attached, you know. So it is important to address, and I think the point that you raise about awareness that is raised by the school is a good responsibility that the school can take this a parent school. I don't know the name that you use in your respective countries, but I think we have done it in our country, and it has been so helpful, you know. Children have different thoughts about what sexuality is. You have a little one that knows everything, and they say, because my parents taught me this with books. And I'm not afraid about sexuality. And you have others that in 5th grade, they cry if you speak about sexuality, you know. They kind of know nothing. So it is important that this awareness of children with sexuality, you know, going on, starts from there little. You're not going to arouse them, you know. And so don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. They are lovely tools for primary prevention. The parents need that as well.
Could you say that again? Because I think it was really important. The children are lovely. What? Could you say that again?
They're you know, they're not angels without any sexuality. I mean, Stuart Allardyce says this in his books, you know. In this book, you know, Working with Children have displayed harmful sexual behavior.
Right.
And so yes, children have they have their own sexuality going on since they're very little, you know. It is very important for them to understand how to be curiosity, to have this curiosity, you know, explained, what the dogs do, how the flowers grow, how the seeds, how an egg goes out from you know, a chicken. Sorry, a hen. Sorry.
It's
So,
okay.
I'm sorry.
It's
I
okay.
apologize. So it is about, it can be explained in a really beautiful way, you know. So we don't need to arrive to the trauma in sexuality. We need to go firstly about the beauties of the sexuality, of us, allowed us to connect each other, to give us a kiss and like it, you know. But then how we do it safely, how we do it in a way that we don't hurt other people, you know. Those are conversations that needs to be going on. If you have a family want to, if your children and cousins play the whole weekend and they go up while you are eating the barbecue out, you know. So those are very sensitive things to do and easy to do if you do it. But if you're afraid to do it, ask the school to do a parents group or something where they can raise the ways that you can talk about this. how you can talk about this, because it's not assertive communication. It's not easy to do while we're talking about sexuality.
And that is something that parents, even now who are listening to this event, can consider doing. Get together there with their school mom buddies or whatever, school dad buddies, and ask the school for some support, whether it's, as you say, Paula, some sort of event on how to talk to your kids about these sorts of things, and you bring in the professionals that can help you. Because I know for a fact many of my friends, when they were raising younger kids, when the kids were younger, they struggled with these conversations. They really did. Having this sort of conversation with kids is very challenging, and they were open to being taught how to have conversations with kids about body safety and consent and stuff. But it's sometimes when you're on your own, or you feel on your own, or just in the dynamic of your own little family, kids get pushed off to the side and it doesn't happen. So parents this is something, we're talking about a fairly large subject, but this is something parents can take from our conversation and go straight to their school or straight to their parent group and say, hey, let's ask the school to do this, and get the ball rolling on it. So it's something that can happen straight away. We need to look at wrapping up this conversation, and I know we could talk for a long time because there's so many things we could discuss and so many different approaches and viewpoints that are all very important and need to be discussed. This particular event is hopefully the first of many, and collaborations, that look at this subject from a global perspective. But as we wrap up, I know Phil had to go because he had someplace else he needed to be. But as we wrap up, what is sort of one thing that you would want and I'll talk slowly so you have an opportunity to think about it before I pick on the first person. What is it that you would want people who are listening, particularly the parents who have school-age kids right now, one thing that you would want to share with them about what you perceive the opportunities are now for continuing to raise awareness, for continuing their journey of understanding about this subject? What is one message you would want them to have? So now let's just repeating myself a little bit. Everybody gets a chance to think for a second. Maria, you go first.
Okay. I think we've talked about this, talking to your kids from the very beginning, and just making it a normal conversation. And I'll confess, as a parent, and as a parent with, a dissociated trauma in her brain, did not do that with my kids. And luckily, as far as I know, I'm lucky, but so I understand how hard it can be. And it seems like it can be silly, like just talk about it, but I couldn't, because I hadn't even talked to myself about my own trauma. But so everybody's coming with their own situations. So it's not always as easy as it sounds. But it's so critical, because I think that is the basis of what Jane just said before, that, in a lot of cases, and in our cases, I think it probably wouldn't have happened if that conversation had happened in my family. So speaking early and like Paula said, just the beauty of it, and don't make it about something that's, you're going to say something that's going to make them a pedophile. That's not going to happen, so just speaking from the beginning, honestly, about the beauty, and then bringing those conversations and awareness that we need to with this conversation too.
That's a great point, Maria. Having a conversation about your children about sexuality generally is not going to turn them into a pedophile. I think that's a great point, a very strong point to make. So thank you for that. Jane.
Apologize. You can edit this out, because the dog is wanting out. Can
Do you want to go let the dog out?
Yeah, let me go, Paula. Can you edit that out?
Yeah. So do you need to go and let the dog out?
No, he's right here scratching at
So
the
I'm
door.
just going to do this so I can see this for myself for later. When can I come back to you? Can I discuss this with you now, or do I need to edit?
Hang on. I'm just going to let him out.
Go. Then come back, and then we'll pick up with Jane again.
He smelled Steve's breakfast.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Now I lost my thought. I apologize.
That's okay. Get your thought back, and
The one thing.
the one thing.
As parents, we try and educate our children. We say, wear your bike helmet, wear your seatbelts, don't eat too much sugar, make sure you're eating enough protein. We worry about all of those things because as a parent, I am a parent, and I'm guilty of over-parenting and hovering and over-controlling. We want the best for our children, we really do. And if someone told me, okay, if your child takes this pill, they won't get brain cancer, would you give them that pill? Would you look into it? If we just sit down and talk to our children and raise awareness, we could possibly prevent something that is incredibly damaging, not just to the child who is traumatized, abused, or caused harm, but your other child. And it's really hard for parents to wrap their head around, but you don't want to be that parent who discovers this and has your family that could splinter. I think Carol Brooks has a great quote. I don't have it at the top of my head, but truly it is a whole family trauma that if you sat down and you talked to your children and it happens, you did the best you could. If you put your head in the sand and it happens, then you're left with all this extra guilt and extra shame. I hear from parents daily, and they tell me, I wish I would have known. I had no idea this was a thing. It is a thing. And if we just normalize the discussion and when you're talking to your children, just incorporate it, we could lessen the numbers.
Great. Thank you, Jane and Paula.
It is the capacity to repair. So we can use as well these what we can have in our hearts to say, I'm sorry, I wish I could have done something different. I was able to do with the forces that I had in that moment, but now I'm learning something different. So I would say that it's very important to provide opportunities for ourselves and not to try to be this perfect family. Families have all types of things, and a parent that is suffering this needs to have a heart that will hold at the same time the person that has, displayed the harmful behavior and the person that is a victim of it, and the parent loves them both, and that love needs to be conserved. And so there's ways to be whole. Don't hold it by yourself. Search for help. Don't keep it in the sand, below the sand, and try to think that complex feelings need to be supported by collaboration, by a lot of people, but so open it. It won't do any harm, but maybe it will unite the family better, and it will increase the possibilities of the family to talk in a sensitive way about important matters. And feelings and deep feelings of loneliness or jealousy or whatever is beyond. So think beyond and try to prepare yourself to ask for help, to have difficult conversation if needed, but also be willing to give an opportunity to repair in your heart and for your family.
I think that's an important way to end this conversation. And I just want to take a moment, it's not easy as easily as we look like we're having this conversation. We also, have to think ourselves through these conversations as well. It's not an easy subject, but the more, we've said it several times, the more we normalize the conversation, the more open we are to discuss these things, to discuss the problems, such as what we were talking about earlier, with confusion around terminology and lack of research and, all of these sorts of things, but also then the willingness to have conversation about what is possible and what are we willing to work towards, both in our little family unit, as our little community, and also the broader society. The more we're able to do that, the better things are. So I want to acknowledge each of you and Phil for coming to today's call and having this conversation and giving so openly to the audience your perspectives, your experiences, and your insight, because I have no doubt that something that each one of us has said has had a real impact in somebody's life and has moved them to do something different. And that's all we can really hope for when we do events like this, is that we move somebody to do something different. And so I want to thank you for that. And I want to thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you for
Thank
having us.
you. Lovely to meet you all.